The moment the doors locked, Nurse Mara Voss counted 11 armed men, 3 blocked exits, and 487 terrified civilians who had no idea the woman standing beside a sick child in the corner was already running numbers in her head. Not medical numbers, but tactical ones. Entry points, sight lines, choke corridors, crowd density per square meter. The gang leader, a thick-necked man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, raised his weapon above the crowd and fired one round into the ceiling of the Caldwell Civic Arena, and the screaming started immediately. Plaster rained down on crying children and elderly flood survivors still wrapped in emergency blankets, and nobody, not one person in that building, looked at the quiet nurse crouched near the cots and thought, "She's the most dangerous person in this room." That was the first mistake. It would not be the last. If this story already has you leaning forward, stay with me until the very end. Hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The flooding had started 4 days earlier. The Kelston River had been showing warning signs for 2 weeks. Swollen banks, muddy overflow in the low-lying districts, emergency advisories that most people ignored because they'd heard it all before. Then the upstream retention barrier at Harwick Junction failed without warning at 2:09 in the morning, and by sunrise, everything south of the industrial corridor was underwater. 40,000 residents displaced in under 8 hours. The Caldwell Civic Arena, a mid-sized events venue on the northern edge of the city, had been converted into the primary emergency shelter almost overnight. Cots in every hall, medical stations near the main concourse, supply distribution running out of the loading docks on the east side. Mara Voss had been working there for 60 hours straight by the time the gunmen arrived. She wasn't the lead nurse. She wasn't in charge of anything, officially. She was listed on the shelter volunteer register as simply Voss M. General Triage Pediatric Support. The shelter coordinator, a harried county emergency manager named Dale Pruitt, had been grateful for any warm body with medical training and hadn't asked many questions when she showed up on day 1 with a trauma bag and a calm face. She'd taken the worst cot assignments, the ones near the loading dock where it smelled like diesel, the overnight shifts with the children who couldn't stop crying, the inventory runs that nobody else wanted to do at 3 in the morning. She hadn't complained once. She had, however, been paying attention to everything: the maintenance layout, the service corridors behind the main hall, the way the ventilation system created dead zones in the northeast corner where radio communications broke up, the rotating schedule of the 2 county sheriff's deputies stationed at the main entrance, the delivery timing for the food trucks, the gap in the perimeter fencing on the western loading side that nobody had bothered to report because the shelter was too overwhelmed to care about fencing. None of that was by accident. Mara Voss didn't think about these things because she was anxious. She thought about them because 12 years of habit had made it as automatic as breathing. But that was a different life. She wasn't supposed to be living that life anymore. She was supposed to be a nurse. The men came in through the main entrance and the loading dock simultaneously at 6:47 in the evening during the dinner distribution window when the largest concentration of civilians was gathered in the central hall. They wore the yellow vests of relief contractors, the same ones worn by the legitimate workers who'd been running supply drops all week. Nobody stopped them at the door. Why would they? There were dozens of contractors cycling through the facility daily, and the 2 deputies at the front had been dealing with a medical incident in the East Wing. The takeover took less than 4 minutes. 11 men, 7 visible firearms, 4 of them rifles, the others carrying sidearms under their vests. They moved to every exit simultaneously, and the gang leader, the scar-faced man who would later introduce himself only as Decker, fired that single ceiling round to establish silence before anyone could react. "Everyone sit down," Decker said. His voice was level, almost bored, which was somehow worse than shouting. "You sit down, you stay calm, you do what we say, and nobody gets hurt. You run, you fight, you do anything stupid, people die. That's not a threat. That's just how the math works." The math. Mara registered that word, the way he'd said it. Practiced. This wasn't improvisation. This was a man who had rehearsed this speech, which meant the operation had been planned in advance, which meant someone had scouted this facility, which meant there was an objective beyond simple robbery or ransom. She filed that away and stayed very still. Beside her, a 6-year-old girl named Petra, whose mother had been in the East Wing receiving IV fluids for dehydration, grabbed Mara's sleeve and pressed her face against Mara's arm without saying a word. Mara put one hand on the girl's back and kept her eyes moving slow and steady around the room, cataloging every detail without appearing to look at anything. The two sheriff's deputies had been disarmed in the first 90 seconds. Both were alive. She could see them zip-tied near the far wall, one with a bloodied lip, neither in serious distress. The shelter coordinator, Dale Pruitt, was being held near the center of the room, visibly shaking. The medical staff, 2 paramedics, and 3 other volunteer nurses, had been identified and corralled into a group near the supply station, presumably to keep them available and controlled. Mara had not been put in that group. She was just a woman with a child clinging to her arm, sitting on the floor near cot row 14, which was unremarkable in every possible way. Good. Within 20 minutes, the gunmen had sorted the survivors into sections: families with children in the central hall, single adults in the east wing, elderly and mobility-impaired civilians in the west corridor where the medical cots were concentrated. It was efficient organization, which told Mara more about Decker's planning than anything else. He wasn't running a chaotic grab. He was managing a population, which meant he intended to be here for a while. One of Decker's men, younger, nervous, with the jumpy energy of someone who hadn't done this before, came through cot row 14 checking people's bags. He reached Mara's trauma kit, unzipped it, saw the medical supplies, and held it up toward Decker across the room. "Got a nurse over here," he called out. Decker walked over. He looked at Mara for a moment. The plain scrubs, the sensible shoes, the slight build, the expressionless face, and made a judgment call that took him approximately 3 seconds. "You." He pointed at the supply station. "Get over there with the others. You're working tonight." "Okay," Mara said. No hesitation, no argument. She handed Petra carefully to an older woman in the next cot, gave the girl a small, steady nod that said, "You're fine, stay here," and walked to the supply station without looking back. One of the paramedics, a heavy-set man named Roy Fulcher, leaned toward her when she reached the group. "There's a diabetic kid in row 7 going hypoglycemic," he said quietly. "They won't let me get to the supply cabinet." "Which cabinet?" "Green one, far wall. Has the glucose gel in it." Mara looked toward Decker, who was now on a phone call near the entrance, not watching them. She walked directly to the green cabinet, opened it, took the glucose gel, and walked back to Roy. "How—" Roy started. "He said we were working tonight," Mara said quietly. "I'm working." Roy stared at her for a second, then took the gel and headed for row 7. The next 2 hours moved in slow, grinding waves. Mara treated a laceration on an elderly man's hand from where he'd fallen when the shooting started. She managed a panic attack for a teenage boy whose father was somewhere in a different section. She replaced a compression bandage on a woman with a leg injury sustained during the flooding, kept the dressing clean, documented the status mentally because there was no paperwork happening tonight. She worked through the medical cases methodically, and every time she moved between patients, she did 2 things at once: treated whoever was in front of her, and added another piece to the map she was building in her head. The gunmen had established a patrol pattern: 3 men walking perimeter, 2 on the main entrance, 2 in the east wing. Decker and 2 others near the center, where he'd set up a field command using a folding table and 3 phones. The remaining man, the nervous young one, was rotating through the civilian sections doing checks. 7 visible. 2 in the loading dock corridor. She'd registered them when a door briefly opened. 1 presumably outside on the perimeter. 11 total, accounting for the count she'd made during the first moments. The exits were locked from the outside. The main entrance had a chain and 2 gunmen. The east wing fire door had been chained as well. The loading dock was controlled. The west corridor emergency exit led to a parking structure currently guarded. But there was a door behind the supply station that didn't connect to any exit. It connected to the building's maintenance level. She'd been in that maintenance level twice since arriving at the shelter. Once to help a maintenance worker named Gerald Spear locate a water valve that was affecting the temporary shower units, and once at 2 in the morning on day 2 when she'd walked the facility perimeter because she couldn't sleep and old habits died hard. The maintenance level ran under the entire north wing and connected to a utility tunnel that passed under the parking structure and emerged at the City Water Authority building 400 meters to the west. She had not told anyone about the tunnel. She hadn't needed to, until now. Around the 3-hour mark, Decker's patience started showing cracks. He was on his phones constantly, and twice Mara caught his voice rising before he controlled it. Whatever was supposed to be happening outside wasn't happening on schedule. The nervous young gunman, she'd started thinking of him as newbie because he was, clearly, exactly that, had stopped rotating through the sections and was hovering near the center, seeking proximity to authority because the ambient dread of the room was getting to him. Good. Anxiety made people sloppy. Roy came back to the supply station looking shaken. He yelled at me, Roy said, meaning Decker. I asked if we could get water to the West Corridor patients, and he just told me to go away. Did you get the water? No? Okay. Mara picked up a stack of water bottles from the station and walked directly to Decker. He looked up from his phone with an expression that could have cut glass. The patients in the West Corridor need hydration, she said. Some of them are post-flood medical cases. If they deteriorate, I'll have a crisis on my hands instead of a manageable population, and that becomes your problem. Decker stared at her. I'm not asking to leave the room, she said. I'm asking to bring water to people 40 feet away. He looked at her for a long, flat moment, then looked away. Carver, he said to one of his men, walk with the nurse. She spent the next 15 minutes in the West Corridor distributing water and talking to patients, and talking to Gerald Spear. Gerald was 64 years old, with bad knees and a lifetime of institutional knowledge about this building's infrastructure that no document had ever bothered to fully record. He had been a maintenance supervisor at Caldwell Arena for 21 years. He'd been sheltering here with his wife when the gunmen arrived, and he was sitting on a cot in the West Corridor looking exactly like what he appeared to be, a tired old man who wanted to go home. Mara sat beside him to check his blood pressure. Gerald, she said very quietly, while the escort gunmen watched the corridor from the far end, bored. The maintenance tunnel under the north wing, does it still connect to the Water Authority building? Gerald went very still for exactly 1 second. Then his expression didn't change at all as he replied, at the same low volume. Haven't used it in 3 years. Gate's probably rusted. Is the gate padlocked or welded? Padlocked. I have the master key. Where is it? On my belt right now. Never take it off. Mara finished the blood pressure check, wrote a fake number on her palm, and stood up. You're doing fine, she said at normal volume, patting his hand. Stay hydrated. Will do, Gerald said. His voice was perfectly steady. She walked back to the supply station with the escort, and her mind was already moving through the next sequence of steps with the kind of focused calm she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not since a different night, in a different country, with a very different uniform. At the 4.5-hour mark, something changed in Decker's demeanor. He stopped making calls and started moving. He spent 10 minutes walking the perimeter of the main hall, counting heads, reassessing the distribution of civilians. Twice he stopped near the West Corridor entrance and looked down the hall with a calculating expression. Then he called his 3 senior men into a brief conference near the entrance, voices low. Roy drifted close to Mara. What are they doing? Planning to move people, Mara said. Move them where? Somewhere else. Smaller location, easier to control. Maybe the East Wing. Maybe outside to vehicles. She kept her voice barely above a breath. If they move us, everything gets harder. Harder how? She didn't answer that directly. I need you to do something for me. Roy looked at her sideways. Who are you? Someone who's treated 5 of your patients in the last 3 hours. That's who I am right now. She met his eyes. I need you to identify the 6 most mobile adults who don't have children. People who can move fast if they need to. Don't say anything to them yet. Just know who they are. Roy was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a former construction foreman in row 3. 2 women near the east wall who look like they do marathons. A retired firefighter in row 9. He's got a bad ankle, but he won't complain about it. And a college kid who's been keeping it together better than any of the adults around him. That's 5. I'll be the 6th. Mara looked at him. Roy was 53, overweight, and probably hadn't run a meaningful distance in a decade. His eyes were scared, but his jaw was set. Okay, she said. 6. She went back to Gerald 20 minutes later with a different escort this time, Newbie, who spent the entire walk watching his own shoes and radiating misery. Gerald was in the same spot. His wife, a small woman with sharp eyes named Dottie, was sitting beside him. Mara sat down and started doing a routine vital check that wasn't routine. "The door behind the supply station," she said. "Bottom hinge needs to be lifted," Gerald said immediately. He'd been waiting. "Swells in humidity. You have to lift and push at the same time." "How far to the tunnel gate from the door?" 40 meters. Straight corridor, one turn right, then a stairway down 8 steps. Gate is at the bottom." "Any lighting?" "Emergency strips on the floor, battery operated, should still work." Dottie hadn't looked at either of them. She was staring at the middle distance with the careful focus of a woman who was listening to everything and pretending to do nothing. "Dottie," Mara said very quietly. "I heard," Dottie said. She still didn't look at Mara. "Tell me what you need me to do." Mara was back at the supply station when one of Decker's senior men walked up and pointed at her. "You're coming with me," he said. Her pulse spiked exactly once, then settled. She followed him across the main hall to where Decker was standing near his command table. Up close, he was bigger than she'd registered, broad through the shoulders, with the specific stillness of someone who had done violence before and wasn't frightened by the concept. He looked her over with a flat, assessing gaze. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been treating patients," she said. "That's what you asked me to do." "I asked you to work. I didn't ask you to have a conversation with half the room." His eyes moved over her face, reading her. "Who are you?" "Mara Voss, volunteer nurse. I've been here since Tuesday." "Where are you normally based?" "Westfield Community Clinic, about 12 miles east." He stared at her for a long moment, the way people stared at things they weren't sure they were seeing correctly. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just also very busy." He studied her for another 3 seconds, then looked away. "Stay where I can see you," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't nothing either. "Of course," she said, and walked back to the supply station without hurrying. Her hands weren't shaking. She noticed that. Made a note of it. Wasn't sure what it meant about her exactly, but set the thought aside because there wasn't time for it. 2 things happened in the next 40 minutes that forced her timeline forward. The first was that the diabetic child in row 7, a 9-year-old named Marcus, went into a second hypoglycemic episode despite the glucose gel, which meant his management was becoming acute and the supply station didn't have what she'd need if he crashed further. She needed the medical bag in the East Wing triage room, which meant navigating a controlled corridor. The second was that she overheard Decker on his phone, not bothering to lower his voice because he'd concluded she was no threat. What she heard wasn't everything. Fragments, half-sentences, but it was enough. "Moving by Euro 200 at the latest. Yes, all of them, that's the whole point. The other location is prepped, just get the trucks." Trucks. A second location, a 2 in the morning deadline. She did the math. It was currently 11:18 p.m. She had less than 3 hours. She walked to Decker, whose back was now half turned toward her while he made another call. "The child in row 7 needs a specific medication from the East Wing triage room," she said. "If I don't get it in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to have a pediatric cardiac emergency on my hands." He covered the phone. "Carver," he said, without looking at her. Carver walked her to the East Wing. The East Wing corridor ran past the service hallway. The service hallway led to the maintenance door. She kept her eyes forward and counted paces. When they reached the triage room, she located the pediatric medication bag with practiced efficiency, and while she was doing it, she pulled a small notepad from her scrubs pocket and wrote 6 words. She folded the paper twice, walked back out, and on the way down the East Wing corridor, she passed Roy Fulcher heading in the opposite direction with a water distribution cart. Their hands were inches apart for exactly 1 second. The paper changed hands so smoothly that Carver, 2 steps behind her, never registered any movement at all. Roy didn't read the note until he was behind the supply station, out of sight lines, 30 seconds later. The note said, "North door, 30 minutes. Bring your 6." What Mara did next required the one thing that was hardest to manufacture inside a crisis, time that looked like nothing happening. She returned to Marcus in row 7, administered the medication, stabilized him, and spent the next 20 minutes moving slowly through the civilian rows as though conducting routine checks. In reality, she was doing 3 things simultaneously: assessing which families had young children who could be guided without panicking, identifying the elderly and mobility-impaired individuals who would need assistance, and making eye contact, quiet, deliberate eye contact with the specific people she needed. She didn't say anything to most of them. She didn't have to. There was a language to it, the slight nod, the hand briefly on a shoulder, the careful way she arranged people's positions on their cots, that communicated something specific to anyone paying close attention. Stay where you are. Don't react. When something happens, don't be surprised. Petra found her during the circuit. The 6-year-old had detached from the older woman and was trailing Mara silently. "Hey," Mara said, dropping to one knee. "You're supposed to stay with Nadia." "I know," Petra said. "I didn't want to." Mara looked at her. The wide dark eyes, the emergency blanket still draped over her shoulders, the complete and total trust in her expression that children gave to people without any of the adult machinery of earned confidence. "Okay," Mara said, "stay with me, but you have to do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. No questions, no noise. Can you do that?" Petra nodded immediately. "Good." At 11:51 p.m., Mara returned to the supply station and made direct eye contact with Roy across the room. He tilted his head almost imperceptibly toward the north side. She gave a single small nod. Then she walked to the maintenance door, lifted it on its swollen hinge exactly as Gerald had described, and pushed. The door opened without a sound. She stepped into the corridor, waited exactly 10 seconds, and Gerald was there, moving faster than his age suggested he should be able to, Dottie right behind him, and Roy and his 5 behind them. Petra was holding Mara's hand with both of hers. 40 meters, 1 right turn, 8 steps down, Mara said quietly. "I know my own building," Gerald said, and led them forward. The emergency floor strips activated as they moved, thin, pale lines of amber light illuminating the concrete floor just enough to navigate by. The air smelled like dust and old water and the particular mineral cold of underground spaces. Behind them, faintly, she could hear the ambient noise of the main hall, voices, movement, the occasional bark of an order. 30 meters to the turn, 20, 10. They rounded the corner and the stairway dropped away in front of them. 8 steps, iron railing, gate at the bottom, exactly as Gerald had described. A heavy mesh gate with a single padlock, green with age but still seated. Gerald had the master key in his hand before they reached the bottom step. The padlock resisted for a moment, grime in the mechanism, and Gerald's hands weren't completely steady. 3 seconds. 4. Mara kept herself very still and did not rush him because rushing would make it worse. The lock opened. The gate swung out. The tunnel stretched ahead of them, low-ceilinged, narrow, the floor strips continuing in twin lines toward a distant point that was invisible in the dark. 400 meters to the Water Authority building. "Go," Mara said quietly. "Gerald and Dottie first. Roy, take Petra." "What about you?" Roy asked. "I'll be right behind you." She waited until the group had moved 20 meters into the tunnel. Then she reached back and pulled the gate partially closed, not latched, just positioned, and stood at the bottom of the stairs listening. Above, through the maintenance door they'd left cracked open, she could still hear the murmur of the main hall. 473 people still in that building. She'd gotten 12 out. 12 who could lead rescuers back through the tunnel, who could report the layout, the guard positions, the patrol timing, the number of gunmen, and their positions. It wasn't evacuation, it was intelligence delivery, and it would only work if there was someone on the outside prepared to receive it. She pulled the gate fully closed, engaged the padlock from inside so the mechanism would slow any pursuit, and turned to follow the group into the dark. She had covered maybe 30 meters when she heard a noise behind her, not from the gate, but from above. A door. Movement. Someone checking the maintenance corridor. She kept walking, steady pace. Didn't run. 40 meters behind her, the gate rattled once, testing. Then silence. Then, distantly, from somewhere above and to the northwest, she heard something that made every muscle in her body go absolutely still for one long second before she started moving again, faster now. It was the sound, almost inaudible through concrete and distance, and the mass of a building between her and the street, of tactical radio chatter. Not the gunman's frequencies, a different kind of traffic entirely. Someone was already outside, already moving, already coordinating in the kind of tight, precise shorthand that only came from one particular kind of unit. She had assumed she was running toward the outside to find help. It was becoming clear that the outside was already coming in. The only question was who they were, what they knew, and whether they had any idea what and who they were dealing with when they got inside. 400 meters ahead, a thin line of light appeared at the far end of the tunnel as Gerald's spear pushed through the tunnel's exterior door, and the sound of the city at midnight filtered in past him like the first breath of something that might, if everything held together, be called rescue. Mara kept moving through the dark and thought about the sound of those radio frequencies, and felt something cold settle in the space behind her sternum that was not fear exactly, but was something she hadn't felt in 8 years. Something that lived in the same room as fear, just on the opposite wall. Recognition. Recognition. That word stayed with her the entire length of the tunnel. 400 meters of low concrete ceiling and amber floor strips, and the sound of 9 sets of footsteps ahead of her moving at varying speeds toward the light that Gerald had opened at the far end. Recognition was the wrong feeling to be having right now. Recognition implied history, and history implied exposure. And exposure was the last thing she needed when she was trying to slip through a tunnel beneath a hostage situation without anyone on either side knowing exactly who she was. She came out through the utility door into a service alley behind the Caldwell Water Authority building, and the cold hit her immediately. The particular wet cold of a post-flood night, the air still carrying river mud, and the chemical smell of emergency pumping operations somewhere to the south. Gerald and Dottie were against the wall, breathing hard. Roy had Petra on his hip, the girl's face pressed against his shoulder. The other 5, the construction foreman, the marathon women, the retired firefighter with the bad ankle, the college kid, were clustered in a loose group near the alley entrance, all of them looking at Mara with an expression she recognized from a long time ago. The look of people who had just understood, slightly too late, that the person they'd been following knew things they didn't. "Now what?" Roy said. Before she could answer, the alley entrance filled with shadows and the sharp, low beam of tactical flashlights, and 3 figures in dark gear came through at a controlled jog with weapons raised to low ready. "Hands," the lead figure said. Everyone's hands went up. Mara raised hers 2 inches slower than everyone else, and she was already reading the gear, the movement pattern, the comms setup, single earpiece, short barrel configuration, the specific way the lead figure had posted at the corner before coming around it. When the lead figure's flashlight found her face and stopped. 3 seconds of silence. "Clear," the figure said into her radio, not looking away from Mara. "We have survivors, 9 civilians." A pause. "And a stand by." She lowered the flashlight slightly. She was a woman, late 30s, angular face, the kind of contained competence that came from years of operating in exactly these kinds of situations. Her name tape wasn't visible. Her unit identifier wasn't visible. Nothing was visible except the gear and the eyes, which were doing a very particular kind of assessment. "What's your name?" she asked Mara. "Voss," Mara said. "Mara Voss. Volunteer nurse. I've been inside since Tuesday." The tactical officer's expression didn't change. "And the rest of the people in there?" 473. 11 armed personnel controlling the space. I have patrol rotations, position counts, comm frequencies, and a layout. She kept her voice flat and factual. "Who do I give that to?" The tactical officer stared at her for a long moment. "Come with me," she said. The command post was set up in the Water Authority building's vehicle bay. 2 folding tables, a tactical map of the Caldwell Arena and surrounding blocks, radio equipment, and 8 people in various states of intense focus. The moment Mara walked in, the room's energy shifted the way rooms shifted when something unexpected entered them. She ignored it, walked to the map table, and started talking. She gave them everything in 7 minutes. Not because she was trying to impress anyone. She'd learned a long time ago that brevity was more valuable than comprehensiveness in the first 60 seconds of a tactical briefing, but because she'd been building the picture for hours, and it was complete. 11 positions, patrol intervals, the command node Decker had established near the main hall entrance, the 2 in the morning deadline for civilian transfer to a secondary location, the physical vulnerabilities in the building's east wing corridor, the maintenance tunnel as a potential insertion point. The lead officer at the table, a broad man with close-cropped gray hair, and the senior officer bearing that came from decades of being the person everyone else looked to, listened without interrupting. His name tape said Marshall. Commander or colonel, she couldn't tell without insignia, and his insignia were covered. When she finished, the room was quiet for about 4 seconds. "You walked the maintenance level on your own initiative," Marshall said. It wasn't quite a question. "Twice," she said. "Old habit." "What kind of habit?" She looked at him directly. "The kind that got 9 people out of that building tonight." Marshall held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like a calculation being updated. "The tunnel insertion," he said. "What's the gate situation?" "Padlocked from inside. I engaged the lock before I left. Your bolt cutters would handle it in under 10 seconds. And the patrol coverage over the maintenance corridor access. There isn't any. The door blends with the supply station wall, and nobody thought to check it. But that changes if they do a structured sweep, which they'll do before any civilian transfer." She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 12:14 a.m. "You have less than 2 hours before they start moving people." Marshall looked at the tactical officer who'd brought Mara in. The officer gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He looked back at Mara. "Sit tight," he said. "I'd rather go back in," she said. "I know," he said. "Sit tight." She sat tight for 19 minutes. She sat in a metal chair against the vehicle bay wall, drank half a cup of cold coffee that someone handed her, and watched the command post operate with the particular kind of attention she'd spent years training herself not to apply to things that weren't her business anymore. Gerald and Dottie had been taken to a medical station outside. Roy was giving a secondary debrief to a different officer. Petra had been reunited with her mother, who had come through the East Wing during the initial chaos and been separated, and who had spent the last 6 hours at an external staging area not knowing if her daughter was alive. And Mara had watched that reunion from across the room with a feeling she couldn't fully name and didn't try to. At the 19-minute mark, a new vehicle pulled into the bay. 2 people got out. One was a woman in a federal jacket. Mara registered the letters without reacting. The other was a man she didn't recognize, younger, carrying a laptop and moving like someone who was used to moving fast between rooms. They went straight to Marshall. 3 minutes of low-voiced conversation. Then Marshall looked across the room at Mara. "Voss," he said. "Come here." She crossed the room and stood at the table. The federal agent was looking at a document on the laptop that the younger man had opened. She turned it so Mara could see the screen. It was a personnel file. Her personnel file. Not the civilian one. Not the nursing license and the Westfield Community Clinic records. The other file. The one with the military seal at the top and the classified notation on the header and the service dates that ran for 12 years before a hard stop with a notation she recognized, even though she'd never actually been permitted to read it. Administrative separation. Grounds. Command negligence. Documentation. Sealed by order of redacted. Mara looked at the screen for 3 seconds, then looked up at the federal agent. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "We've been building a file on the operation inside that building for 6 weeks, the agent said. Her voice was careful and professional. "The hostage event isn't isolated. It connects to a larger infrastructure fraud operation involving emergency management contracts. When Marshall reported a volunteer nurse who provided tactical-grade intelligence on a live hostage situation, I ran your name." She paused. "Mara Voss, formerly Staff Sergeant Voss, 75th Combat Medical Support Detachment, 2 combat deployments, commendation for mass casualty coordination in Sector 12, and then—" She stopped. "And then nothing," Mara said. "And then nothing," the agent agreed. "Sealed file. Administrative separation. No commendation issued." Marshall was watching her, not with suspicion anymore. With something closer to the expression she'd seen on Gerald's face when she'd said the word tunnel, the look of someone realizing they'd been standing next to something they hadn't understood until this exact moment. "Why are you working a volunteer nursing shift in a flood shelter?" the agent asked. Mara looked at the file on the screen for a moment. "Because people needed a nurse," she said. "And I'm a nurse." The agent opened her mouth to ask something else. "She needs to go back in," Marshall said quietly. Everyone at the table looked at him. "They're moving civilians in under 2 hours," he said. "If they transfer to a secondary location, we lose control of the situation entirely. We need eyes on the inside that the subjects don't know about." He looked at Mara. "I can't order you to do anything. You're civilian." "I know," she said. "If you go back in through the tunnel, you're on your own until we move. No comms, no support, no—" "I know." she said again. He studied her for a moment, then nodded once. We'll move at 0145. You need to have them positioned before we come through. Positioned how? He turned to the map and spent 90 seconds explaining what he needed. Mara listened without interrupting, asked 2 precise questions, got 2 precise answers, and memorized everything. Then she looked at the clock. 12:33 a.m. 72 minutes. I need 2 things, she said. Name them. A small light source. And someone needs to tell me what Decker's real name is, because he recognized something in me, and I want to know if I recognize something in him. The federal agent turned the laptop and typed something. The result came up in 4 seconds. Brendan Harwick, the agent said. Former emergency logistics contractor. Federal indictment pending for infrastructure fraud, emergency contract manipulation, disaster relief diversion. 3 prior arrests, no convictions. She paused. And 1 prior military service record, 2 years, discharged. Discharged, not separated, not retired, discharged. Mara filed that away. Marshall handed her a compact flashlight from the kit on the table. Don't use it unless you have to. I know, she said for the 3rd time, and walked back toward the tunnel. Sam. Coming back through was harder than going out. The tunnel was the same tunnel, the same 40 meters of corridor, the same 8 steps. But moving toward a situation was categorically different from moving away from one, and her body knew it even when her mind was clear. She'd experienced this distinction many times in a different context. The specific way the nervous system behaved when you were going towards something dangerous with full knowledge of what was waiting rather than running from it in reactive mode. It wasn't fear. It was something more like the feeling of stepping off a curb deliberately, knowing the drop, choosing it anyway. The padlock had held. She used the key she'd palmed from Gerald. She'd taken it from him in the alley without making a production of it, and he'd let her without asking why, because he was smarter than he looked, and came through the gate, up the stairs, and back into the maintenance corridor. She stopped at the bottom of the stairway for 30 seconds and listened. The murmur of the main hall, the occasional voice, no immediate sound in the corridor. She went up. The maintenance door opened on its hinge. She stepped back into the supply station area, and nobody was looking at her. The room was in the particular suspended state of a population that had been frightened for hours and had reached the exhausted, hollow plateau beyond active fear. People lying on cots, children asleep against their parents, the older civilians motionless with the specific stillness of people conserving themselves for something they didn't know was coming. She registered 3 things immediately. Roy was back. He caught her eye from across the room and gave one very small nod. He'd come back through the tunnel behind her, she realized. Sometime in the 19 minutes she'd been at the command post, and she hadn't known because she'd been sitting against the wall drinking cold coffee and watching the room. She would think about that later, that he'd made his own decision, on his own time, and come back in without being asked. The second thing she registered was that Decker, Harwick, was on his phone again, and his body language had changed from the controlled authority of the earlier hours to something tighter and less managed. The timeline was pressing on him. Whatever was supposed to be happening at 0200 was now less than 90 minutes away, and it was clear from his posture that the logistics weren't clean. The third thing was that Newbie, the nervous young gunman, had positioned himself in the east wing doorway, and he was watching Mara with an expression she needed to neutralize before it became a problem. She walked directly to him. I was with the pediatric case, she said before he could speak. Row 7. I told Carver when I went. Carver didn't say anything. Then talk to Carver. She held his gaze. The child's blood sugar is stabilized. I'm going back to the main floor. He stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment. He was maybe 22. The weapon on his hip was too large for his frame. His eyes had the red-edged look of someone who hadn't slept and was running on cortisol, and the particular anxiety of being in a situation that had turned out to be larger than he'd expected when he signed up for it. She could see him deciding. Fine, he said, and stepped aside. She walked past him without hurrying. The next 40 minutes required a different kind of work. Not tunnel finding, not intelligence collection. That was done. What she needed now was placement. Marshall had been precise about it. When the tactical team came through the tunnel insertion point, the critical factor was the first 15 seconds of entry, and the critical factor in the first 15 seconds was where the civilians were. Bodies in the wrong positions created confusion, line-of-sight problems. the risk of crossfire or panic movement. Bodies in the right position stripped the gunmen of their cover and their leverage simultaneously. She couldn't brief people directly. She couldn't walk the floor explaining what she needed. So she did it the way she'd done every difficult thing tonight, by moving through the room, patient by patient, appearing to do one thing while actually doing another. A blanket adjusted here put a child closer to the east wall, away from the main corridor. A pillow repositioned there shifted a family group 6 feet to the left, where they'd be behind the concrete support column when the east wing door came open. A quiet conversation with an elderly man about his circulation issues moved him from the center of the room to a spot near the north wall where he'd be out of the movement zone entirely. She worked without appearing to work, without drawing attention, and the room moved around her like water adjusting in a vessel, the population redistributing itself in ways that looked entirely natural because she'd made it look entirely natural. Roy tracked what she was doing without being told. He started his own circuit on the opposite side of the room, nudging people into positions that complemented what she was doing, never looking at her, never making it visible. It was the kind of unspoken coordination that she'd experienced exactly twice before, in circumstances she tried not to think about, and the fact that a 53-year-old paramedic in a flood shelter was executing it with reasonable competence, without ever having done anything like this in his life, said something about him that she filed away as well. At 1:08 a.m., Harwick stood up from his command table. He said something to his 3 senior men, and all 4 of them began moving through the room in a coordinated pattern. Not checking on civilians, assessing them, counting, moving them. The transfer was starting early. Mara moved to the center of the room and said, loudly enough to be heard across the main hall, but quietly enough to sound like a medical instruction rather than an alarm. Everyone with children, stay together. If you have a child with you, hold their hand now. Several parents reached for their children automatically. One of Harwick's men looked at her sharply. What are you doing? Preventing panic, she said. If you start moving people without warning, someone's going to run, and then you have a problem. She met his eyes. Let me manage the medical cases and the children. You'll move people faster. He looked at Harwick. Harwick, across the room, looked at Mara. In the 3 seconds of that exchange, she understood what was happening in his head. The calculation she'd seen him making since the moment he'd first noticed her wasn't quite right. He was suspicious, but not certain. He needed the logistics to work, and she was right that a panic event would compromise them. The utility of having her manage the civilian population outweighed the risk she might represent. He nodded. Stay with the medical cases, he said. Of course, she said. She turned away from him, and in the precise moment that she turned, she looked at the clock on the arena's scoreboard display, which was still running on backup power and still showing the time. 1:11 a.m., 34 minutes. She needed to hold the transfer in place for 34 minutes, and she needed to do it by being more useful to Harwick's operation than whatever alternative he was considering, which meant she had to keep performing competence in his service while she was actually performing something else entirely. Across the room, she saw Roy position himself beside the 3 families with the youngest children. Right at the edge of the cluster, she'd spent an hour moving toward the northwest corner, the corner farthest from the east wing tunnel entrance and closest to the support columns. She gave him a look that meant, stay there. He gave her a look back that meant, obviously. Then one of Harwick's men grabbed her arm. He wants you, the man said, meaning Harwick. Her heart rate climbed 2 notches and settled. She walked across the room. Harwick was standing with his phone face down on the table and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled, practiced authority of the early hours. Something harder. Something that came from a plan going sideways in ways that weren't fixable with competent management. The transfer is delayed, he said. She waited. Which means we're here another 2 hours minimum. He looked at her directly. I need you to keep this room stable. No medical emergencies, no panic events, nothing that creates noise. Can you do that? Yes, she said. I need a commitment, not a yes. She looked at him steadily. The room stays stable, she said. That's what I've been doing for the last 6 hours. He studied her, and then he said something that she hadn't expected. You were military, he said. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't let a single thing cross her face. I was a lot of things before I was a nurse, she said. That's not a denial. It's not a confirmation either. Harwick stared at her for a long moment, and she saw it. The thing she'd registered from the beginning. The thing that had made her uncomfortable in a way she hadn't been able to name until she'd seen his real name on the laptop screen. He knew. Not details, not her file, not her history, but the category of thing she was, the specific kind of stillness, the absence of panic, the way she'd been running this room for 6 hours in plain sight. He knew because he'd been around people like her once, before the discharge. "The tactical unit outside," he said quietly. Not a question. She said nothing. "They're coming in," he said. Still not a question. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he turned to the nearest gunman and said, "Lock down the maintenance corridor, now." She was already turning, already moving back toward Roy and the northwest corner, when she heard Harwick's voice rise behind her with something that was not quite panic but was adjacent to it, calling orders she didn't fully catch because the blood was loud in her ears, and the clock on the scoreboard read 1:19 a.m., and there were 26 minutes left, and the maintenance door was about to be found. She reached Roy in 8 steps. "Change of plan," she said. "How much change?" he asked. "Significant," she said, and her mind was already 3 moves ahead, running the revised sequence, recalculating the positions. Because the tunnel insertion was now compromised and Marshall's entire entry plan had just become something that needed to be rebuilt in the next 4 minutes, with nothing but the people in this room and whatever Mara could hold together with her bare hands. "Significant how?" Roy asked again, because he needed more than that, and she knew it. "The tunnel's blown," she said. "They're checking the maintenance corridor right now. When they find the gate's been used, Harwick knows we had help going out, which means he knows there's a team outside, which means he changes everything. Positions, timing, threat posture." She was speaking fast but not rushing, the kind of speed that came from compression rather than panic. Marshall's entry plan assumed surprise through the tunnel. That's gone. "So what do we do?" "We give them a different kind of surprise." Roy stared at her. "With what?" She looked at the room. 473 people, 11 gunmen, 2 of whom were now moving toward the maintenance corridor at the back of the facility. 9 remaining, distributed across 4 positions. "With 473 people," she said, "who are going to do exactly what I tell them." She didn't wait for Roy to process that. She was already moving. Well, the first thing she needed was noise control, which meant she needed to talk to the room without Harwick realizing she was talking to the room. She started at the west corridor, walking through it at the pace of a nurse doing rounds, crouching beside cots, speaking low and direct. "When I give a signal, I need every person in this corridor to get onto the floor, not crouch, flat on the floor. And I need you to cover any children with your body and not move. Can you do that?" Most of them nodded without speaking. A few looked terrified. One woman asked what was happening, and Mara said, "People are coming to help us. They need a clear path," which was true and incomplete in equal measure, and the woman nodded and grabbed her husband's arm. She moved through the East Wing next, the same message delivered in 8 different versions to 8 different clusters of people. Then the outer ring of the main hall, working inward, always staying near the walls, always appearing to be checking someone's injury or adjusting someone's blanket. It took 11 minutes. At the end of the 11th minute, she had seeded the message through approximately 60% of the civilian population, enough that it would propagate through proximity when the moment came, enough that the room would go down rather than scatter. She was crouched beside an elderly woman in row 2 when she heard Harwick's voice from the far end of the room, sharp and controlled, and directed at her. "Voss." She stood up slowly and turned. He was 15 feet away. 2 of his men flanked him. His expression had moved past suspicion into something more precise and more dangerous. The look of a man who had run a calculation and arrived at a conclusion he didn't like but wasn't going to avoid. "The gate in the maintenance tunnel was engaged from the inside," he said. She waited. "You went out," he said, "and you came back." Around them, the room had gone very quiet. Not silent. There was still the ambient noise of hundreds of people, but the immediate vicinity had developed the specific tension of a space where everyone could feel that something was about to happen and nobody wanted to be the one who triggered it. "I went to get help," she said, "and then I came back." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because there are 473 people in this building and I wasn't going to leave them." Harwick studied her. The two men flanking him hadn't moved, but their hands had shifted position in the small, automatic way of people preparing for something without consciously deciding to. "You talked to the team outside," he said. "Yes." "You gave them the layout." "Yes." "And they're coming in." She didn't answer that one because the answer was yes and no, and the truth was more complicated than either option, and she needed him talking rather than acting. "Brendan," she said. That stopped him. His real name, not the operational handle, and the effect was precisely what she'd intended. The fractional hesitation of a man who hadn't heard it in this context in a long time, if ever. "Whatever you think is happening outside," she said, "is not worth what happens in this room if this goes wrong. You have 400 people, including children and medical cases. Some of them won't survive a crossfire event. Some of them are already fragile." She held his gaze. "You want to walk out of this. That's still possible, but only if the next 20 minutes go the way I'm going to suggest they go." Harwick looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "What are you suggesting?" "Let me position the civilians away from the entry points," she said. "All of them. Center of the room, sitting, hands visible. Your men maintain positions. When the team comes in, nobody panics, nobody moves, the situation stays controlled. You get a clean arrest, and so does your crew, and none of these people get hurt. That's not a negotiation. That's a surrender. It's a choice between a clean outcome and a chaotic one." She didn't flinch from it. "You've already lost the operation. The infrastructure contracts, the fraud case, the people you're working with outside, that's a federal matter, and it was before tonight. You're not walking away from that. The only thing you can still control is what happens in this room in the next 20 minutes. Harwick was quiet. Newbie, near the east wing door, had gone completely rigid with the specific tension of someone who was processing a situation that had become much larger than he'd signed up for and didn't know which direction to break. One of the senior men, Carver, said something low to Harwick that Mara couldn't catch. Harwick looked at Mara one more time. "Position them," he said, and the room exhaled. She had 15 minutes, and she used every second of them. The civilian population moved in waves, families with children to the center, then the single adults surrounding them in a ring, then the elderly and mobility impaired arranged at the edges where they had the most protection from the concrete support columns without being in corridors. Roy worked the opposite side of the room, and between them they moved more than 400 people with a speed and organization that looked like standard emergency shelter management and was actually something else entirely. The gunmen watched, but didn't interfere. Harwick had given the word, and his men followed it, which told her something about the structure of his operation: tight command, obedient crew, the kind of discipline that worked fine when the plan was intact and became a liability when the plan had already failed. She was guiding a cluster of families toward the center section when she felt it before she heard it. A vibration in the floor, very slight, the kind of thing you registered through the soles of your feet rather than your ears. Movement. Below the building. Multiple contacts. Marshall was in the tunnel, which meant the timeline had compressed further than she'd calculated, or Marshall had made an independent assessment of the situation and moved early, or both. She straightened up from the crouch she'd been using to speak to a child and spoke at full room volume for the first time all night. "Everyone down, now. On the floor, cover your children, don't move." The room dropped. Not perfectly. There was a wave of confusion. A few people who hesitated, one man near the east wall who started to stand up rather than down before the person beside him grabbed his arm. But the majority went to the floor with the specific decisiveness of people who had been quietly told to expect exactly this moment and had been holding the instruction in the back of their minds for the past hour. The gunmen reacted. Carver shouted something. Two of them moved toward the east wing. One of them, the man she'd been thinking of as the third senior, who had no name she'd assigned, turned toward Mara with his weapon rising. The east wing door came off its frame. Not explosively. There was no breaching charge, no flashbang, just a precise, controlled application of force that sent the door inward. And the first tactical officer was through the gap before the sound of the impact had fully registered. And then two more behind her, and the room became a controlled sequence of events that had been choreographed for exactly this layout. The civilians were in the center. The gunmen were at the perimeter. The entry team came through the east wing and the main entrance simultaneously, and the geometry of the room, the geometry she had spent 2 hours adjusting, meant the gunmen had nowhere to push their advantage. It wasn't clean. Carver fired once. The round went into the ceiling because the officer who reached him got to his weapon arm before his trigger finger completed the movement, and the struggle was brief and loud and ended with Carver face down on the floor with two officers on him. The third senior man, the one who had turned toward Mara, found himself in the open with three weapon systems pointed at him and made the correct calculation, which was to put the gun on the floor and raise his hands. Newbie sat down on the floor without being told and put his hands on his head and started crying. Mara stayed low and kept moving through the civilian cluster, checking for injuries, because the trauma of the past 6 hours was going to produce physiological responses, and there were people in this room who had real medical conditions, and she wasn't done working yet. Marcus in row 7. She checked him first. Blood sugar, responsive, stable. The elderly man from the west corridor. The woman with the leg injury. The teenage boy whose father was in a different section. She was kneeling beside a woman who had hyperventilated into unconsciousness. Not uncommon in high-stress situations, not dangerous if managed. When she registered that the room had gone quiet in the specific way that meant the tactical phase was over. 11 gunmen. She looked up from the unconscious woman to confirm what she'd known by sound. Every one of them was down, restrained, or in the process of being processed. The entry team had spread through the space with the efficiency of people who had practiced exactly this scenario, and the layout she'd spent the night adjusting had given them the geometry they needed. She looked for Harwick. He was near the main entrance, wrists restrained, a tactical officer on each side. His face was unreadable in the specific way of a man who had made his decision and was processing the downstream consequences of it, and she felt something complicated about that. Not sympathy exactly, but the acknowledgement that the situation was more layered than clean outcomes usually allowed. He looked up. Their eyes met across the room. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. The next 30 minutes operated at a different pace. The careful, methodical pace of aftermath, which had its own kind of intensity but moved in a different register. Medical triage of the civilian population. Systematic processing of the detained gunmen. Communication between the entry team and the command post outside. People finding family members they'd been separated from. People crying. People sitting very still staring at nothing. People asking questions that couldn't be answered yet and needed to be answered eventually. Mara moved through it all doing what she'd been doing for the past 6 hours, which was the work that was directly in front of her. The federal agent came in through the main entrance at 1:53 a.m., and she found Mara crouched beside a child who had a fever that wasn't related to the night's events at all. The child had been running a temperature since the flooding, 3 days of a slow burn that her mother had been managing with ibuprofen and couldn't get treated because the shelter system was overwhelmed. "You need a moment?" the agent said. "No," Mara said, still addressing the child. "I need a pediatric transport to Harwick Memorial." She caught herself. "To whatever hospital is taking pediatric cases tonight. Kelston General is the designated receiving facility." "Kelston General. This child is non-emergency but needs evaluation." She looked up at the agent. "What do you need from me?" The agent had a recorder. She documented everything Mara gave her. The timeline, the positions, the conversations with Harwick, the specific words he'd said about the federal case, and the infrastructure contracts and the secondary location. It took 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, the main hall around them gradually transformed from a hostage situation into an emergency shelter again. Cots straightened, supplies redistributed. The county emergency management personnel, who had been locked outside since the takeover now, moving back through the building with the particular harried energy of people who had lost 6 hours and were trying to reconstruct their situation. Marshall found her when she was finishing the debrief. He stood in front of her for a moment without saying anything, which was itself something. A senior tactical officer who didn't immediately fill silence. "You repositioned 400 people without triggering a panic event," he said. "I repositioned about 60%, she said. "The rest moved because the people around them did." "You talked Harwick into compliance." "He talked himself into compliance. I just didn't give him better options." Marshall looked at her with the expression she'd been seeing on people's faces all night. The expression of a recalculation completing. And she was tired enough that she didn't have her usual defenses against it. "Voss," he said, "I know what you're going to say." "Do you?" "That the file is already open." She meant the sealed personnel file. The one the federal agent had pulled up on the laptop at 12:33 a.m. The one with the administrative separation notation and the redacted authorization and the commendation that had never been issued. And once a file is open, it doesn't close just because the night is over. That's one way to put it, he said. She looked at him directly. I've been a civilian for 8 years. I'm a nurse. I work at a community clinic in Westfield, and I take the early shift because nobody else wants it. And I'm good at what I do. You are, he said. That's also not all you are. She didn't answer that. He pulled a card from his jacket and held it out to her. Plain, military contact format. Nothing on it, except a number and a designation she recognized even though she hadn't seen it in 8 years. When you're ready, he said. Not tonight, not this week. When you're ready. She took the card. She didn't know yet whether she would use it. 8 years of distance from that life was also 8 years of constructing a different one, and she wasn't naive enough to think the past few hours had resolved anything about who she was or what she wanted to be going forward. They had resolved the immediate situation, which was the only thing she'd been trying to do. She put the card in her scrubs pocket, next to the compact flashlight Marshall had given her 3 hours ago, and walked back into the main hall. Dawn was a long way off. The shelter had been a crisis zone for 6 hours, and it was going to take considerably longer than 6 hours to return it to functional emergency operations. People needed to be reassessed. Medical cases that had been deferred during the lockdown needed immediate attention. The supply logistics that had been disrupted needed to be rebuilt. Dale Pruitt, the shelter coordinator, was moving through the space with the expression of a man trying to triage a disaster within a disaster and barely holding it together. Mara found him near the supply station at 2:20 a.m. The West Corridor medical cases, she said. 2 of them should have been transferred to Kelston General 3 hours ago. The woman with the compound leg laceration needs a surgical evaluation. The bandaging has been maintaining, but it's been maintaining for too long. And there's a man in row 11 whose blood pressure has been climbing since before the lockdown. I've been managing it, but he needs a cardiologist. Pruitt stared at her. He had met her on Tuesday, when she had signed in as a volunteer and he had been grateful for the extra body and hadn't asked questions. He was now looking at her the way everyone had been looking at her for the past hour. I'll get the transports, he said. Thank you. Who are you? He said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Mara Voss, she said. Volunteer nurse. I've been here since Tuesday. He looked at her for another moment, then nodded and went to make the calls. Roy found her at 2:35 a.m., leaning against the supply station wall eating half a granola bar someone had handed her at some point. He sat down on the floor beside the station and put his back against the wall as well, and didn't say anything for a minute. That thing you did, he said eventually. In there, moving all those people. We moved them, she said. I moved 12 people, he said. You moved 400. She didn't argue with the math. Is that... Roy stopped, started again. Is that something you learned, or something you just are? She thought about it honestly, which wasn't something she usually let herself do. Both, she said, and neither. It's complicated. Seems like it. They sat in silence for a while. Your card, he said. She looked at him. The one Marshall gave you. You're going to use it. I don't know that. I do, he said. Not cruel about it, just certain. She looked at the granola bar wrapper in her hand rather than at him. I built a different life, she said. Yeah, Roy said. You also just ran a hostage extraction with a maintenance worker, a retired firefighter, and me, and none of us died, so. He shrugged. Life's complicated. She almost laughed. Almost. At 3:10 a.m., the federal transport vehicles moved the detained gunmen out of the building in a processed sequence. Harwick went last, and he walked through the main hall with the unhurried bearing of a man who had decided his posture for what came next and was maintaining it. He didn't look at Mara as he passed, except at the last moment, just before he reached the main entrance. He stopped, turned his head, and said, not to anyone in particular, but audible to everyone near the entrance, "Good room management." Then he walked out. It was the most oblique acknowledgement she was likely to get from a man like that, and she took it for what it was, which was nothing and also something, and went back to work. The sun wouldn't come up for another 4 hours, and there were 473 people in this building who needed food, water, medical attention, and the gradual, difficult process of recovering from a night that none of them had expected. She was still a nurse. She was still working. At 3:44 a.m., Roy came to find her again, moving fast this time, his expression carrying something different from the exhausted steadiness it had held since the tactical team arrived. "There's a woman in the East Wing," he said. She was already moving before he finished. "What's presenting?" "Chest pain. Started 5 minutes ago. She didn't want to say anything because she didn't want to." He stopped. "She said she didn't want to make trouble." "How long has she been symptomatic?" "She says maybe 40 minutes, maybe longer." 40 minutes of chest pain in a woman who had spent 6 hours in an acute stress situation in a flood shelter. Mara registered the full weight of that without letting it show on her face and broke into a controlled jog. The woman was in her early 60s, gray-haired, sitting upright on her cot with the specific rigid posture of someone trying to manage pain by not acknowledging it. Diaphoretic. She was sweating through her emergency blanket despite the cool temperature of the East Wing, left arm positioned awkwardly, the shoulder set at an angle that suggested referred pain. "What's your name?" Mara said, crouching in front of her. "Edna," the woman said. "Edna Caraway. I didn't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone." She took Edna's wrist. Pulse check. Elevated. Irregular. "Edna, I need you to tell me exactly what the pain feels like." "It's like—" Edna stopped. Her face went through something complicated. "Like something sitting on my chest, and my jaw hurts. Is that—" She stopped again. "Yes," Mara said. She was already turning toward Roy. "I need the AED from the supply station, the aspirin from the red kit, and a transport to Kelston General started now, not queued now." Roy ran. Edna looked at Mara with the expression of someone who had spent the entire night being frightened of the wrong thing. "Am I having a—" "We're going to take good care of you," Mara said. "Stay with me, Edna." She kept her voice level and her hands steady and her attention completely on the woman in front of her, and behind that focused exterior she was doing the specific, unsparing calculation of a person managing a cardiac event with inadequate equipment in a non-hospital setting following 6 hours of acute patient stress. The calculation of what was possible and what was probable and what the margin was between them. The AED arrived. The aspirin. She administered both with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions than a flood shelter and would do it in worse conditions again. The transport request confirmation came back 60 seconds later, 7 minutes out. She told Edna, 7 minutes. Edna nodded and kept breathing and kept her eyes on Mara's face with the specific focus of someone who had decided that the nurse in front of her was the thing keeping her tethered to the right side of this situation. "You've been here all night," Edna said at one point, her voice thin but present. "I have." "Did you ever—" A pause. A breath. "Did you ever think about leaving?" Mara looked at her. "No," she said, and meant it completely, and the meaning was more layered than Edna understood, and exactly as simple as it sounded, both at the same time. The transport arrived in 6 minutes. She went with Edna to the loading bay and handed her off to the paramedics with a full verbal report. Onset, presentation, interventions, response, timeline, and watched the vehicle leave and then stood in the loading bay doorway breathing the cold post-flood air for exactly 30 seconds before she turned and went back inside. There were 460-something people still in that building. She was still working. But at the exact moment she turned away from the loading bay, the federal agent who had debriefed her at 1:53 a.m. came through the East Wing door with an expression that Mara read in the first quarter second and understood meant something had shifted in the last hour beyond the operational resolution of the hostage situation. "We need to talk," the agent said. "Now." "What is it?" The agent held up a phone. On the screen was a document, the kind of document that moved through federal channels in the hours after an operation, when people were still processing and reporting and the full picture of what had actually happened was assembling itself from the pieces. "The infrastructure fraud case," the agent said. "The one Harwick was connected to. We've been building it for 6 weeks. She paused. "The sealed portion of your military file, the administrative separation authorization. The name on it matches a name that appeared in our case documentation 2 weeks ago." Mara looked at the phone. "The officer who authorized your separation," the agent said carefully, "has been taking emergency contract payments for 3 years. Kelston County, Harwick's network." The cold air from the loading bay was still on her skin. She looked at the document on the agent's phone. The name was there. Clear. Unredacted in this version of the document, which was a federal investigative file rather than a military personnel record. Colonel Declan Pruitt. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in 8 years. She had thought about it in the way you thought about the source of a specific kind of damage. Not constantly, not obsessively, but present the way a healed break was present in cold weather. The officer who had put her name on the separation order instead of his own after his planning decision had gotten 3 soldiers injured in a sector she'd told him wasn't stable. The man who had written the report that buried her commendation and ended her career, and who had apparently, in the years since, found other ways to leverage his position for personal gain. The same network. The same fraud. She had walked into the middle of it by accident on a Tuesday afternoon when a river flooded and a shelter needed a nurse. He's being charged, the agent said, along with 11 others in the contract network. The Harwick operation tonight gives us the physical evidence we needed for 3 of those charges. She paused. Your file is part of the federal documentation now. It can't stay sealed. The loading bay door behind Mara opened wider as another transport vehicle moved out, and the cold air came through in a long wave, and she stood in it and did not feel anything dramatic or cinematic about what the agent had just told her. What she felt was tired. And then, underneath the tired, something quieter and more durable that she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Something that might eventually become relief, if she gave it enough space to grow. What happens now? She asked. That depends on a few people, the agent said, including you. She looked at the document on the phone one more time. Then she looked up. I have 400 patients to check on, she said. Where do you need me after that? The agent looked at her with the expression Mara had stopped being surprised by tonight. The recalculation, the reassessment, the quiet revision of whatever category they'd been using for her. I'll be here, the agent said. Mara nodded and walked back into the shelter, and she was 20 feet inside the main hall, moving toward the West Corridor medical cases, when she heard a commotion near the main entrance that was a different register from anything that had happened tonight. Not the sharp urgency of a tactical event, but the specific escalating tension of an argument between people with institutional authority, and the voice she could make out most clearly above the others was Marshall's, and what he was saying was not good. Not your jurisdiction. And another voice, one she didn't recognize. She needs to come with us now. She kept walking, steady pace, toward the West Corridor. Whatever was happening at the main entrance was about her. She had understood that from the first word. She didn't stop walking. That was the first decision. Not to turn around, not to move toward the argument at the main entrance, not to let the sound of her name in someone else's mouth redirect her from the woman with the leg laceration in the West Corridor who had been waiting too long already. Whatever was happening at the entrance would find her when it was ready to find her. Right now there was work. The woman with the leg injury was named Constance Brierly, 61, former schoolteacher, who had been managing her own dressing changes for the past 3 hours with the grim competence of someone who had decided that complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. Mara pulled back the bandaging and looked at the wound. A deep laceration on the lateral calf, sustained when floodwater had pushed her through a fence during the evacuation from her neighborhood. Clean margins, no active bleeding, but the tissue edges had been approximated imperfectly during the initial dressing, and there was the beginning of inflammatory response that needed a surgical consult. This is going to hospital tonight, Mara said. I've been trying to tell people that for 2 days, Constance said. I know. I'm sorry it took this long. She redressed the wound with clean materials from the supply cart. Transport is coming. You're on the list. The shooting earlier, Constance said. Are you? Everyone's fine, Mara said. Focus on staying still. She was taping the final edge of the dressing when she heard the footsteps behind her. 2 sets. Deliberate. The specific cadence of people who had been told where to go and were going there. She finished the tape before she turned. 2 men. Neither of them in tactical gear. One in a county official jacket, the other in a suit that had been immaculate 6 hours ago and was now carrying the wrinkles of a long night. The suited man had the bearing of institutional authority, the practiced stillness of someone who managed things from distances and wasn't accustomed to being the person in the room who came to other people. Mara Voss, the suited man said. Give me a moment, she said, and turned back to Constance. Keep it elevated. Don't walk on it. Constance looked at the two men and then back at Mara with the sharp assessment of a woman who had spent decades reading rooms full of children and knew when something was wrong. You be careful, Constance said quietly. Always, Mara said, and stood up and faced the two men. The suited man's name was Aldrin Foss, and he was the regional director of County Emergency Management, Dale Pruitt's boss, and 3 levels above the shelter coordinator in the institutional hierarchy that governed the facility. He had arrived at the Caldwell Arena at 3:20 a.m., 40 minutes after the tactical resolution, and he had spent those 40 minutes at the main entrance having a conversation with Marshall and the federal agent that Mara hadn't been present for and could reconstruct from its effects. He wanted her in an administrative interview room. Now. I'm in the middle of patient care, she said. Ms. Voss, I have 6 active medical cases in this corridor and a cardiac transport I'm coordinating. When that's complete, I'm available. She held his gaze without hostility, which was sometimes more effective than pushback. 20 minutes. Foss looked at the county official, who looked at Mara, who didn't look away from Foss. 15, Foss said. She nodded and turned back to the corridor. She used the 15 minutes and then walked herself to the administrative office that had been converted into an interview space, a room she had passed 11 times since Tuesday and had noted as the room with the bad overhead lighting and the folding table and the view through a small window into the main hall. She sat down across from Foss without waiting to be invited to sit, because the invitation was not something she intended to let him control. The county official sat to Foss's left. A recorder appeared on the table. This is an administrative inquiry, Foss said. Not a legal proceeding. You're not required to have representation present. I know, she said. You entered this facility as a volunteer medical worker on Tuesday at approximately 1400 hours. That's correct. During the hostage event this evening, you made a unilateral decision to move civilians through a maintenance tunnel without authorization from shelter management or law enforcement. She looked at him. Shelter management was zip-tied to a wall. Law enforcement had been disarmed. The authorization structure was compromised. You also made contact with an external tactical unit and provided them with interior intelligence, again without authorization from people who were under armed guard, she said. Yes. Foss pressed his lips together. I was in his 50s, with the soft institutional authority of a man who had spent a career managing processes rather than emergencies, and she could see the specific frustration of someone whose procedural framework had been bypassed by events that didn't wait for the correct forms to be filed. Ms. Voss, he said, I'm trying to understand why a volunteer nurse was making tactical decisions that, because someone had to, she said, not heated, just direct. And the people whose job it was to make those decisions were unavailable. You had no authority. I had 473 people, she said. That was the authority I had. The room was quiet. The county official, who hadn't spoken yet, and whose role in this meeting Mara hadn't fully determined, was looking at his notepad with the careful attention of someone who was writing something down because it was easier than making eye contact. Foss opened a folder. Inside it was a document she recognized even upside down, the shelter volunteer register, her entry from Tuesday. You listed your employer as Westfield Community Clinic, he said. That's correct. You listed your role as general triage and pediatric support. That's correct. There's nothing in your listed credentials that indicates any specialized training beyond clinical nursing. She said nothing. Foss closed the folder and looked at her directly. A federal officer informed me an hour ago that your military personnel file has been flagged in connection with an ongoing investigation. She declined to provide details. He paused. I'm asking you directly, Ms. Voss. Who are you? It was the third time tonight someone had asked her that question. The first time she'd deflected. The second time she'd answered as simply as she could. This time she looked at Aldrin Foss, at his institutional jacket and his procedural folder and his legitimate, reasonable confusion about the night's events, and gave him the most honest version she had available. I'm a nurse, she said. I'm also someone who had training before I was a nurse that made me useful tonight. The two things are both true and not in conflict. Foss stared at her. Every person in that building is alive, she said. Every medical case I identified before the lockdown received appropriate intervention. The civilian population was positioned correctly when the tactical team entered, which is why there were no crossfire injuries. None of this was unauthorized. It was necessary. She let that settle. If you want to discuss what authorization structures should look like in future events of this nature, I'll contribute to that conversation. But we're not going to sit here and construct a version of tonight where the problem was me. The county official's pen had stopped moving. Foss looked at the folder, looked at the recorder, looked at Mara. "This inquiry is adjourned for now," he said. "You'll be contacted for a follow-up." "Of course," she said, and stood and walked out. Marshall was in the main hall when she came through the door from the administrative corridor, leaning against the wall near the supply station with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had been waiting. "Boss," he said, not a question. He adjourned. "He'll be back." "I know." She stopped beside him and looked at the room, the gradual, effortful reassembly of a functioning shelter from the wreckage of 6 hours. "What happened at the entrance when I was in the west corridor?" Marshall was quiet for a moment. "Someone called Foss before we completed the situation," he said. "We don't know from inside our team. The call told him a civilian nurse had been involved in the tactical operation in a way that could create liability exposure for the county." He paused. It was framed as concern for protocol. It was also a very fast call to make, given that the situation had resolved approximately 12 minutes before Foss arrived. She absorbed that. "Someone wanted him here early," she said. "Someone wanted the administrative layer down before the federal case had time to establish itself." He looked at her sideways. "Pruitt has people in county systems. Has had for years, apparently." Declan Pruitt. The name from the federal document. The colonel who had signed her separation order and had been taking emergency contract payments through Harwick's network for 3 years. "He knows the file was flagged," she said. "We think so. The federal agent is moving faster than she planned to because of it." Marshall uncrossed his arms. "There's a hearing. Not tonight. Sometime in the next 72 hours. The federal case is moving to formal charges and your file is part of the evidentiary record." He looked at her. "She wants your testimony. Voluntary. Your choice." She thought about the card in her pocket, the phone number, the designation she recognized. "Tell her yes," she said. Marshall nodded. Across the room, near the main entrance, a cluster of county officials had gathered around Dale Pruitt, who was gesturing at a clipboard with the exhausted energy of a man trying to rebuild his operation from the ground up at 4 in the morning. The shelter was alive again, imperfectly, incompletely, with the particular fragile momentum of a system that had been disrupted and was feeling its way back toward function, and Mara watched it for a moment before she went back to work. The dawn shift of shelter volunteers arrived at 5:30 a.m. By then, Mara had been on her feet for nearly 3 days with interrupted sleep that didn't fully count as rest, and the specific quality of her fatigue was the kind that settled into the muscles rather than the mind. Her thoughts were still clear, clinical, processing correctly, but her body had moved into the register of pure maintenance, doing what it needed to do on stored capacity. She briefed the incoming volunteers with the same efficiency she'd used on everything else, patient by patient, case by case, the status of every medical situation in the building rendered in clean, usable terms that the incoming team could act on without confusion. It took 22 minutes. When she finished, the lead volunteer, a registered nurse named Petra Solis, who had the look of someone who had heard about the night secondhand and was trying to reconcile the account with the quiet, tired woman standing in front of her said, "Is there anything else we should know?" "The maintenance corridor door behind the supply station needs a new hinge," Mara said, "and Marcus in row 7 needs his blood sugar checked every 90 minutes until transport." Petra Solis wrote it down. Mara handed over the medical notes she'd been keeping in her head and on a legal pad she'd found in the administrative office, said she'd be available by phone, and walked out of the Caldwell Arena into the thin gray light of a morning that hadn't quite decided to arrive yet. She slept 4 hours in the back of a county vehicle that someone, Roy, she suspected, without asking, had arranged for her use. She woke when her phone rang at 9:47 a.m. and lay still for 2 seconds reading the number before she answered. It was the federal agent. Her name, Mara had learned at some point during the debrief, was Celine Marsh. "Pruitt filed a counter-complaint this morning," Marsh said, "through his attorney, against you." Mara sat up. He's claiming that your actions during the hostage event were unauthorized, that you misrepresented your credentials during shelter registration, and that the intelligence you provided the tactical team was obtained through, and I'm quoting, self-authorized covert activity inconsistent with a civilian medical volunteer role. A pause. He's trying to get the file locked again. If the file is locked, the evidentiary connection between his name and the contract payments loses its primary documentary anchor. He's trying to make me the story, Mara said. He's trying to make you the problem, Marsh said, which keeps him out of the frame. She looked out the vehicle window at the parking lot of the Caldwell Arena, where county vehicles and federal units were still moving in and out in the careful choreography of an active investigation site. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you at the federal building downtown at 2 this afternoon. We're doing a formal recorded statement. I also need you to know that Pruitt's attorney contacted County Emergency Management this morning and suggested that your volunteer registration was fraudulent. It wasn't." "I know, but Foss is going to call you." "I know," she said. Foss called 40 minutes later, and it was a shorter conversation than the 4 a.m. interview because Mara had spent the intervening time thinking precisely about what she was and wasn't going to let happen, and the conversation went accordingly. She did not raise her voice. She did not provide more information than was asked for. She said she would be available to the county's process and that her registration had been accurate and complete, and that she had documentation of her nursing license and her volunteer application that she would provide through whatever channel the county required. Foss said he appreciated her cooperation. She said she was sure he did, and ended the call. The federal building in downtown Kelston was 12 stories of institutional concrete and energy-efficient glass, and it had the specific ambient quality of a place where consequential things happened in unremarkable rooms. Marsh met her in the lobby at 1:52 p.m. and walked her to the 4th floor without much preamble. The conference room was larger than she'd expected. There were 4 people already at the table when she arrived. Marsh, a second federal officer she hadn't met, a woman introduced as Assistant U.S. Attorney Vivian Cordell, and a man in his mid-40s with a military bearing and civilian clothes who had been introduced as a Department of Defense Inspector General's representative. His name was Supervisor Brand. The DoD IG's presence meant the military personnel file had graduated from a federal evidence item to an active investigative matter on the military side, which meant someone above Marsh's pay grade had decided that Pruitt's file wasn't just relevant to the fraud case. It was a problem in its own right. Mara sat down across from Cordell and looked at the documents arranged on the table in front of the attorney's position. She could read several of them from where she sat. The sealed administrative separation order, the contract payment records, a timeline document that she couldn't read the specific contents of, but whose structural layout she recognized as the kind of document that connected points across time. "Before we begin," Cordell said, "I want to be direct with you about what this afternoon is and isn't." She had the measured precision of someone who chose words for their legal weight before she deployed them. "This is a voluntary recorded statement. You're not a defendant or a subject. You're a witness whose personal history intersects with an active federal case in a way that makes your testimony material." She paused. "You can have legal representation present if you choose." "I don't need representation for the truth," Mara said. Cordell looked at her steadily. "That's your call." "It is." The statement took 3 hours. It was the most complete accounting of 12 years of her life she had given anyone, and she gave it in the same register she'd used all night. Clear, sequential, factual, without emotional amplification or self-justification. The deployment, the sector assessment she'd given that Pruitt had overridden, the incident, the 3 injured soldiers, the report that Pruitt had written that inverted the chain of events and placed the decision-making responsibility on her, the administrative separation that followed, which had been structured to look like a mutual agreement and had been no such thing, the 8 years since. Brand asked most of the questions about the military portion. His face gave away very little, but twice she caught the specific micro-expression of a person hearing something that confirmed what they had already suspected, which told her that the IG's office had been looking at Pruitt for reasons that predated tonight. At the 4-hour mark, Cordell set down her pen. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Not for the record." She nodded at the recorder, and the officer beside her reached over and stopped it. "We have 11 individuals connected to the contract fraud network. Pruitt is the highest ranking. The counter-complaint his attorney filed this morning is, and I say this professionally, not going to achieve what he intends it to achieve. Mara waited. The evidentiary weight in this case runs in one direction, Cordell said. It has since before last night. Last night added a physical evidence component and a witness account that significantly strengthens the existing documentation. She looked at Mara directly. His attempt to put you in the frame is documented. The timing of it is documented. That documentation becomes part of the case. He's been doing this for a long time, Mara said. Yes, Cordell said. He has. Brand leaned forward slightly. The DoD has an internal process for reviewing administrative separations in cases where the file documentation is subsequently found to be materially inaccurate, he said. It's not fast. It doesn't undo time. But it exists, and it's been initiated. She looked at him. Your commendation was recommended by 2 separate officers before the separation order voided it, he said. That recommendation is in the record. She had not known that. She sat with that for a moment. The specific weight of learning that people had tried, that it hadn't been only Pruitt's uncontested authority moving against her, but a system imperfectly working in both directions at once, and then set it aside for later, because later was when she'd have the space to feel what she needed to feel about it. What happens now? She said. Now, Cordell said, we file. The charges against Declan Pruitt were filed at 6:15 p.m. on a Thursday, which was approximately 38 hours after Mara had walked into the Caldwell Arena for what she'd expected to be her 4th consecutive shift, distributing water and monitoring vital signs. She was not present at the filing. She was at Westfield Community Clinic, covering the late afternoon appointments because Dr. Anaya Ruiz, the clinic director, had called her at noon to say that she'd seen the preliminary news coverage, and that if Mara wanted to come in, she should come in, and if she wanted to stay home, she should stay home, and either way, the clinic would support whatever she needed. She came in. There were 14 appointments between 2 and 6. She saw all of them. A respiratory infection in a 7-year-old. A blood pressure management follow-up for an elderly man who hadn't been taking his medication on schedule. A wound check for a teenager who'd gotten a bad cut on a job site. The ordinary, accumulative, necessary work of keeping people functional. She was writing notes on the last appointment when Anaya came into the exam room and put a phone on the counter with the screen facing up. The news feed showed the federal building. Cordell at a podium. The words on the chyron beneath the image. Federal charges filed. Emergency contract fraud. 12 defendants, including retired Colonel Declan Pruitt. She read it twice. You okay? Anaya said. Yes, she said, and kept writing the notes. Anaya stood in the doorway for a moment. Anaya had been running this clinic for 9 years and had hired Mara 4 years ago on the strength of a recommendation from a colleague and an interview where Mara had given the most technically precise answers to clinical questions she had ever encountered in a hiring process. She had never asked about the gap in Mara's resume between the end of her military service and the beginning of her civilian medical work, because it wasn't her business, and Mara's competence had always been evident. The news is saying a nurse from this clinic was involved in the Caldwell Arena situation, Anaya said carefully. The news is accurate. Do you want to tell me anything? Mara finished the last sentence of the note and looked up. I was the volunteer nurse on shift when the situation developed. I managed the medical cases and assisted in the resolution. I'll be giving testimony in the federal case. Anaya looked at her for a long moment. Okay, she said. Your patient in room 3 has been waiting 8 minutes. I know, Mara said, and stood up. She drove home at 7:30 p.m. through the specific quiet of a city that was in the middle of something it hadn't finished processing yet. The flood recovery was ongoing, but the streets south of the industrial corridor were still restricted. The water authority was running emergency protocols. The shelter at Caldwell was still operating at capacity. The hostage event had generated a separate current in the city's awareness, the kind of story that moved fast and produced more heat than light in its initial hours before the full shape of it became clear. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building on Orchard Street, 3 blocks from the clinic, with a window that faced west and caught the last of the evening light. She had lived there for 2 years, which made it the longest she'd stayed in one place since leaving the military. The apartment was not particularly comfortable or particularly decorated. She'd furnished it with the specific minimalism of someone who had spent a long time not accumulating things. But it was hers, and it was quiet, and right now those were the only qualities that mattered. She sat on the couch and did not turn on the television. She thought about Edna Caraway, and whether Edna had made it through the cardiac event all right. She thought about Marcus and his blood sugar and whether the dawn shift had checked him on schedule. She thought about Constance Brierly's leg and whether the surgical consult had happened yet. She thought about Petra, the 6-year-old, and her mother, and the reunion she had watched from across the room without letting herself feel it in real time because there wasn't time. She was still thinking about them when her phone buzzed. Marsh. Pruitt's attorney filed a motion to suppress the personnel file, Marsh said. We expected it. It won't succeed. Cordell's been ahead of it since this morning. A pause. But I wanted you to know before you saw it somewhere else. Okay. There's something else. She waited. His motion included an affidavit, Marsh said, from Pruitt himself. In it, he characterizes your actions in the shelter as, I'm summarizing, the behavior of an unstable individual with a personal vendetta against him, operating under the guise of civilian medical work. Mara looked at the window. The light was almost gone. He's claiming you knew he was connected to the Harwick operation before you entered the shelter, Marsh said, that you positioned yourself there deliberately, that last night wasn't crisis response. It was, and again I'm summarizing, a targeted operation against him personally. She said nothing. Cordell will demolish it, Marsh said. The timeline alone makes it factually impossible. You were registered at that shelter since Tuesday. The federal case connection wasn't even visible to us until the night of the event. Another pause. But it's going to be public. His attorney filed it in open court. I know, she said. Are you? I'm fine. She paused. Tell Cordell I'll provide whatever supporting timeline documentation she needs. Already asked. She says she has it. She ended the call and sat in the quiet apartment and felt, for the first time since the doors had locked at 6:47 p.m. 2 nights ago, the full weight of what the last 38 hours had actually been. Not pride, not vindication. That wasn't here yet, and she didn't know if it ever arrived in the form people imagined it did when they thought about it in advance. What she felt was something older and more complicated. The specific fatigue of having carried something for 8 years and having it finally become visible to people who had the authority and the obligation to look at it, and not knowing yet what happened after that. Not knowing whether the systems that had failed her would correct themselves or construct new ways to continue failing. Not knowing whether the file and the charges and the testimony would ultimately produce the outcome that the word justice implied, or whether it would produce a lesser, more institutional version of that word that left her in roughly the same place. She didn't know. She sat with not knowing, which was different from despair and different from hope, and was in some ways harder than either. Her phone buzzed again. Text message, unknown number. She opened it. 3 words, and a name she hadn't seen since the morning's documentation. Watch your back. And below it, as if to ensure she understood the source, Pruitt. She looked at the message for 10 seconds. Then she called Marsh. He just contacted me directly, she said. I'm sending you the message. A moment of silence on the line. Then Marsh's voice, which had changed in a specific way. Don't delete it, she said. Don't respond. Stay where you are. I'm not going anywhere, Mara said. I'm sending someone to your building. That's not necessary. Mara. Marsh's voice had the exact quality that voices got when they were trying to communicate urgency without triggering the response they were trying to prevent. He just committed witness tampering in an active federal case. That's not a man who's managing his situation well. That's a man who's making bad decisions under pressure. She looked at the message again. Pruitt had spent 8 years as an untouchable, a man with institutional authority and a sealed file and a network of contract relationships that had made him progressively more insulated from consequence. And now, in the space of 38 hours, all of that had reversed. The file was open, the charges were filed, the network was exposed, and he had responded to the pressure of consequence by sending a 3-word text to the witness whose testimony was most damaging to him. It was the move of a man who had always operated from a position of power and didn't know how to function without it. It was also, she understood with cold clarity, potentially the move of a man who had decided that if consequence was coming regardless, the only lever left was fear. I'll leave the light on, she said. The officer will be there in 12 minutes, Marsh said. She put the phone down and looked at the window, at the dark that had settled fully over the city now, and at the reflection of her own face in the glass. tired, clear-eyed, not frightened, which she noted with the same factual attention she'd been paying to everything for 38 hours. The knock on the building door came in 11 minutes, not 12. She buzzed the officer in. And then, somewhere below the apartment, she heard a second sound. Not the officer on the stairs, but something else, from the direction of the building's back corridor. The kind of sound that was almost nothing, and that she registered not through analysis, but through something much older. The specific attentional wiring of a person who had spent years in situations where almost nothing sounds were the ones that mattered most. She stood up very slowly. She moved to the apartment door before the second sound finished registering, not because she'd made a conscious decision to move, but because the body that had spent 12 years training in exactly this kind of attentional space made the decision first and brought the rest of her along with it. The back corridor of the building ran from the service entrance to the stairwell. One exit point at each end. The sound she'd heard, fabric against a wall or a heel catching concrete, the specific acoustic signature of a person trying to move quietly and not quite succeeding, had come from the direction of the service entrance. She stood at her apartment door and did not open it. She listened instead and counted and thought about the 11 minutes between Marcia's call and the officer's knock on the building door, and whether 11 minutes was enough time for Pruitt's people to have positioned someone who wasn't the officer, and concluded that it probably wasn't, and then concluded that probably wasn't the same as certainly, and stayed where she was. The officer knocked on her apartment door 30 seconds later. "Ms. Voss, Officer Delray, Kelston PD." "Badge number," she said through the door. A pause. Brief, professional, the pause of someone who understood why the question was being asked. 4471. She opened the door. Officer Delray was a woman in her early 40s, compact, with a calm that matched Mara's own. She looked at Mara standing in the doorway without having opened it fully and processed the posture correctly. "Something in the building?" she said. "Back corridor. Could be nothing." It wasn't nothing. Delray called it in before she moved, which was correct procedure, and also bought them 4 minutes before a second unit came through the building's main entrance and cleared the service corridor from the opposite end. What they found was a man Mara didn't recognize, 40s, no immediate identification, positioned in the corridor's maintenance alcove with a phone in his hand, and no credible explanation for why he was in a residential building at 8:15 p.m. in a section that wasn't accessible to the public. He was detained. His phone, examined with his reluctant and then legally compelled cooperation, had recent call records connecting him to a number that Marsh identified within the hour as belonging to a former military contractor with documented ties to Pruitt's network. It was not a clean operation. It was, in fact, an extraordinarily sloppy one. The improvised action of a man who had spent his career directing other people to manage problems and, now cornered, had reached for the only lever he had left and pulled it badly. Marsh called at 9:03 p.m. "Pruitt was arrested 40 minutes ago," she said. "The text message was sufficient for the warrant, and the person in your building gave us the rest. His attorney is already filing motions, but the witness tampering charge alone—" She stopped. "He made it worse. He made it significantly worse." Mara sat on the couch she'd been sitting on when the text arrived, which felt like a long time ago and was actually less than 2 hours. "Okay," she said. "Are you all right?" She thought about the question honestly. "I'm tired," she said, "but yes." "Get some sleep," Marsh said. "It's going to be a long few weeks." She slept 9 hours, which was more consecutive sleep than she'd had in 4 days, and she woke at 6:20 a.m. to the specific quality of morning light that came through her west-facing window as a reflection off the building opposite rather than direct sun. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory, the way she'd done every morning for 8 years, a habit from a different life that she'd never managed to stop, and found that the inventory was different than it had been the morning before. Not better, exactly. Not resolved, but different in the specific way of things that had been moving underground for years and had finally broken the surface, messier than they'd been when they were contained, but real in a way that contained things weren't. She made coffee and checked her phone. 14 messages. She read them in chronological order, which took 20 minutes and produced a picture of the night's downstream events that she hadn't been awake to witness. Cordell's office had filed the additional witness tampering charge at 11:47 p.m. Pruitt had been processed and was being held pending a bail hearing that his attorney had already announced they would contest. 3 of the 11 other defendants in the fraud case had agreed to cooperation deals in the hours since the arrest, which Marsh's message at 1:33 a.m. described as significant acceleration of the evidentiary timeline. Brand from the DoD IG's office had sent a formal message through Marsh at 2:08 a.m. noting that the administrative review of Mara's personnel file had been elevated to priority status. She read that one twice. Then there was a message from Roy Fulcher, sent at 11:22 p.m., which said, "Edna Caraway is stable. Procedure went well. Her family says thank you." She put the phone down and drank her coffee and let that one sit where it landed. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way the night at Caldwell Arena had been dramatic. They were the slower procedural drama of a legal system doing its work. Depositions, hearings, the careful assembly of documentary evidence into the shape of a case that would hold. Mara testified 3 times in various contexts. Once in a formal federal deposition that took 6 hours, once in a preliminary hearing where Pruitt's attorney attempted to characterize her as a witness with compromised credibility due to her administrative separation, and once in a closed session with the DoD IG's review board that lasted 4 hours and covered terrain she'd spent 8 years not talking about to anyone. That last session was the hardest. Not because the questions were hostile, Brand ran the board and his questions were precise and fair, but because answering them required her to reconstruct a sequence of events she had spent considerable effort not reconstructing, to lay out in clinical detail the decision points and the consequences and the specific mechanisms by which a superior officer's error had become her official record. She did it with the same flatness she'd applied to everything else. And when it was done, she sat in her car in the federal building parking garage for 10 minutes before she drove home. Not because she was falling apart, but because 10 minutes was what the thing required before she could set it down again. The preliminary hearing produced the moment that became the story's public face, though Mara wasn't trying to create a public face and would have preferred not to have one. Pruitt's attorney, a man named Garrison Holt, who had spent 3 decades cultivating a specific kind of courtroom authority, made a sustained argument across 45 minutes that Mara's presence in the shelter had been premeditated interference in a law enforcement matter, and that her military background, far from making her a credible witness, demonstrated a pattern of insubordination toward institutional authority that the court should weigh carefully. Cordell's cross-examination took 11 minutes. She asked about the contract payments, about the dates, about the specific emergency management contracts in Kelston County that had been awarded to Harwick's network in the 3 years since Pruitt's retirement, about the signed authorizations, about the meetings documented in the network's communication records. Holt objected 14 times. 12 of the objections were overruled. By the end of the 11 minutes, the courtroom had a different shape than it had at the beginning, and the person who felt it most visibly was Pruitt himself, sitting at the defense table in the specific rigid stillness of a man who had believed, until very recently, that the architecture of protection he'd built around himself was structural, and was now understanding that it had been contingent all along. Mara watched him from the witness gallery with the same attention she'd applied to every room she'd been in for the past 2 weeks. And what she saw wasn't satisfaction. Satisfaction was too simple for the layered, complicated thing that was actually happening in her chest, but something closer to the completion of a long arithmetic problem whose answer she'd been carrying around unverified for 8 years. He had known. She'd known he had known. Now everyone in that courtroom knew he had known, and the knowing was a matter of public record. That was what justice looked like up close. Not a thunderclap, not a moment of cinematic reversal, but a fact becoming permanent. The DoD Administrative Review concluded 6 weeks after the night at Caldwell Arena. Mara was at the clinic when Brand called. She was between patients, a gap of 11 minutes between a follow-up appointment and a walk-in that the front desk had just logged, and she took the call standing in the hallway outside exam room 2, with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she needed to hear clearly. The review board has found that the administrative separation order filed in your case contained material factual inaccuracies in the command decision documentation, Brand said. Specifically, the incident report attributed decision-making authority to you that the board's reconstruction of the operational record places clearly with the commanding officer. A pause. The separation is being reclassified. Your service record will reflect an honorable discharge. She put her hand flat against the hallway wall, not because she needed it for balance, just because something needed to be touching something solid right then. The commendation recommendation that was voided by the separation order, Brand continued, has been reinstated and approved. It will be formally presented at a ceremony at Kelston Federal Complex on the 14th of next month, if you're willing. She was quiet for a moment. I'm willing, she said. There's one more thing, Brand said, and she heard something in his voice that was slightly different from the careful official register he'd maintained throughout. This doesn't undo the time. I want to be direct about that. The review process isn't designed to compensate for 8 years, and it doesn't. What it does is correct the record. I know, she said. Some people find that insufficient. She thought about it, genuinely, not as a formality. 8 years of a different life, the clinic, Westfield. The early shifts nobody else wanted, the apartment on Orchard Street with the west-facing window, and the minimal furniture and the absence of accumulation that had been a kind of freedom and a kind of loss simultaneously. It's not insufficient, she said. It's accurate. The record being wrong was the problem. The record being corrected is the solution. She paused. The years are mine. They were mine when they were happening, and they're mine now. I'm not asking anyone to give them back. Brand was quiet for a moment. The 14th, he said. 1,000 hours. I'll be there, she said, and went to see her next patient. The sentencing in the fraud case came 3 months later. Pruitt received 7 years on the primary fraud counts, with additional time on the witness tampering charge that his attorney had failed to have dismissed despite sustained effort. The judge's remarks during sentencing were factual and unadorned. The case was what it was. The documentation was extensive. The harm to public systems was concrete and quantifiable. Pruitt sat through it with the same rigid stillness he'd carried since the preliminary hearing, and when the sentence was read, he didn't react visibly, which Mara had expected. Men like that didn't break in public. They went inward and stayed there. 8 of the 11 co-defendants had pleaded in the months prior. The remaining 3 received sentences ranging from 18 months to 4 years. Brendan Harwick, who had locked the doors of the Caldwell Arena on a Thursday evening with 487 people inside, received 9 years on the hostage and fraud charges combined, with the additional charges from the secondary location operation that had been dismantled the same night adding 2 more. He had not contested the charges. Mara read the sentencing results on her phone during a lunch break at the clinic and put the phone away and ate the rest of her lunch and went back to work. Roy texted her that afternoon. They got what they got. You doing okay? She texted back, yes. You? Yeah. Weird day. Yeah, she replied. Weird months. He sent back a single character that she interpreted as agreement, and she went to see her 2:30 appointment. The commendation ceremony on the 14th was smaller than she'd anticipated, which was fine. There was no audience of hundreds, no public event, no journalists. The military did not publicize administrative correction ceremonies, which were internal proceedings dressed in the formal language of institutional acknowledgement. There were 12 people in the room: Brand, 2 members of the review board, Marsh, Cordell, Marshall, 3 officers. Mara didn't know who were present in official capacity, an administrative clerk, and 2 people Mara had asked to be there. Roy Fulcher sat in the second row of chairs looking like a man who had put on the best shirt he owned and was uncertain whether it was good enough. Gerald Spear sat beside him in his maintenance supervisor jacket, the same one he'd been wearing when Mara had asked him about a tunnel under a building in a city that had briefly become a very small and very precise world. Dottie had come too, sitting on Gerald's other side, and she had brought a small wrapped object that she pressed into Mara's hand before the ceremony started and refused to explain. Open it later, Dottie said. The ceremony itself was brief. Brand read the commendation citation: mass casualty coordination under hostile conditions, civilian protection during an active hostage event, sustained tactical assessment and execution in the absence of authorized command structure. And Mara stood in the front of the room and listened to the official language render the night at Caldwell into something formal and permanent, and thought about how strange it was that the most significant night of the past 8 years of her life was now also documented in the precise, effectless language of military commendation. Both things were true at once. When Brand pinned the commendation to her jacket, she kept her eyes level and her expression composed. Not because she didn't feel anything, but because what she felt was too layered for expression, and she was fairly certain that if she let any of it into her face, she'd lose the composure she'd been maintaining for 8 years, and she wasn't ready to do that in a government conference room in front of 12 people. After, standing near the window with Roy and Gerald and Dottie, while the officials gathered their things, she opened Dottie's package. It was a key. A master key, old and green with age, attached to a small tag that said in Dottie's handwriting, "For the next time you need one." She looked at it for a moment, and then she laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere she hadn't been accessing lately, and it surprised her enough that she covered her mouth with her hand before she let it come the rest of the way out. Gerald said, "She's been carrying that in her purse for 6 weeks, waiting to give it to you." "I wanted to find the right moment," Dottie said, with the dignity of a woman who was entirely certain she had found it. Roy was grinning. He looked like he'd been waiting for her to laugh since the night at Caldwell and had been patient about it. She closed her hand around the key. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Marshall called. She'd been expecting it, in the way you expected things you'd been carrying in your peripheral vision for months without looking at directly. She let the phone ring twice before she answered, not from hesitation, but because she was finishing a patient note and she finished what she was doing before she moved to the next thing. "Voss," he said. "I know why you're calling," she said. "Then I'll make it short." He did. The position he described was advisory, not active tactical deployment, not a return to the field in the way she'd been in the field before. A civilian advisory role with the DoD's Emergency Medical Response Coordination Office, which had been working to redesign mass casualty shelter protocols following a federal review that had identified significant gaps in crisis management guidance. The review had identified those gaps partly by examining what had happened at the Caldwell Arena, which had produced better civilian outcomes than existing protocol would have predicted, and the office wanted to understand why and build from it. It was not a dramatic offer. It wasn't a restoration of what she'd had. That wasn't possible, and she'd already told Brand she wasn't asking for it. It was something new, with her actual experience, her actual skills, applied to a problem that was real and ongoing and that she was probably better positioned to address than most people. "Part-time," she said. "I'm keeping the clinic." A pause. That wasn't the offer on the table. "It is now," she said. Another pause, longer this time. "Part-time," he said. "We'll work the schedule." She looked out the window of the exam room, which faced east, opposite direction from her apartment window, and showed her the back of another building and a strip of sky above it that was the specific gray-blue of late afternoon in a city that was still drying out from a flood and getting on with things the way cities did. "I'll call you next week," she said. She put the phone down and thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who couldn't stop noticing exits and patrol patterns and the structural vulnerabilities of rooms, not as a pathology, not as a burden, but as a fact of who she was. The military had built some of it. The rest had been there before, the thing that made her the person who took the overnight shifts. Nobody wanted and walked the perimeter at 2 in the morning and filed away the location of a tunnel because old habits died hard. That person had always existed. Pruitt had tried to make it a liability. The past 3 months had clarified that it wasn't. She thought about Petra, the 6-year-old, who had held her hand with both of hers in the dark, and trusted her without any evidence except the quality of how she moved. About Edna Caraway saying I didn't want to make trouble while her jaw hurt, and something sat on her chest. About Constance Brierly managing her own wound dressing for 3 days because the system around her was overwhelmed and she'd decided that complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. She thought about all the people who made themselves smaller so as not to inconvenience a situation that was already failing them. She'd spent 8 years making herself smaller. Not consciously, not entirely, not in every room, but in the ways that mattered. She had taken up less space than she had before Pruitt's report had been written, and she had called it building a different life. And it was both true and not the whole truth simultaneously. The whole truth was that some of the life she'd built was real and earned and hers, and some of it was the shape that silence takes when it's been held for a very long time. She was 51 years into her life, and the record was corrected, and Pruitt was in a federal facility, and Harwick was in a federal facility, and Marcus's blood sugar was presumably being managed appropriately, and Edna was stable, and Constance had seen a surgeon, and Petra was somewhere being 6 years old with her mother, and Mara Voss was sitting in an exam room at the Westfield Community Clinic with a master key in her jacket pocket and a commendation on her service record and a phone call to return next week, and the next patient was waiting. She stood up. She was not the person you overlooked. She had never been the person you overlooked. She was the person who let you overlook her when it was useful, and knew the difference, and chose accordingly. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. The entire architecture of how she had moved through that building on the worst night Caldwell had seen in its history, and through the weeks that followed, and through 8 years before that. Not by being unseen, but by understanding exactly what was visible and what wasn't, and building from what she knew rather than what the room assumed. She opened the exam room door and called the next patient's name, and she went back to work, not because it was all she had, but because it was what she chose, which was a different thing entirely, and the difference was everything.